Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines, and in this programme we'll be discussing what lies behind this huge escalation in terrorism and violence being directed against Israel, as only last week we saw that two Israeli brothers were murdered in their cars by Palestinian terrorists in the northern part of Samaria, which is Judea and Samaria. There's also speculation that Hamas, the Islamic terrorist organization based in Gaza, are preparing for a third intifada or Palestinian uprising against Israel in the weeks ahead as we approach the Islamic month of Ramadan. And so we'll be talking about the security situation in Israel and the urgent need that Christians need to be praying for the peace of Jerusalem at this time. And in tonight's programme, I'm joined by Melanie Simmons, who's editor of Heart newspaper. Melanie, warm welcome to Behind the Headlines, and it's great to have you on the programme.
Thank you very much. It's a joy to be here.
Pleasure. Melanie, what are your thoughts on what we're really seeing in Israel now? I know through your newspaper that you have a lot of articles relating to Israel as a major feature of your newspaper, and also for your readers as well. But what do you think we're seeing behind this huge escalation in terrorism and violence being directed at Israel this time?
Well, there is incitement going on. That has always been the case. And often the Israelis cover what's really going on, what the Palestinians are being told, which we certainly don't hear in the West. So if something does erupt, the Western media will be surprised, and of course it'll probably be the Israelis' fault. There is incitement going on. I know you've said to me about TikTok that's being used, and there are a lot of discontented young people in the Palestinian-controlled areas who feel that there's a lot of corruption, nothing's happening, and they want a bit of action.
Yeah, sadly they're vying for blood. So what we saw last week, for example, was that there was escalation of Palestinian violence and terrorism being directed against Israel. And we saw that this happening last week in Judea and Samaria after Palestinian terrorists opened fire on two young Israeli brothers named Hallel Yaniv and Yigal Yaniv. One of them was serving in the IDF and the other one was about to serve as they drew through the Arab village of Huwara. We saw then that the cold-blooded murder of two Israeli brothers actually sent shockwaves throughout the Jewish settler movement. And in retaliation, Jewish extremists set fire to rows of vehicles before moving on to torch homes and shops in Huwara. This was then fueled further by Israel's Finance Minister Smotrich, who reportedly said that Israel should wipe out the Palestinian town of Huwara in response to the murder of these two young Israelis, and calling to Orly Goldschmidt from the Israeli embassy, and she's the spokesman, writing for The Guardian. She said that in 2022, the Jewish state suffered over 5,000 Palestinian terrorist attacks. So we'll be asking what lies behind this massive wave of terrorism against Israel, and could we be heading for a third Palestinian intifada or uprising? I suppose what we really see is they don't really understand the full scale of the threats and the terrorism that's been directed against Israel. And this is very reminiscent of what we saw in 2000 during the Second Intifada. Everyone thought that peace was going to break out at the Camp David Accords. There we had President Clinton, the American president, together with Huwara, Israel's prime minister, and chairman Yasser Arafat of the PLO, thought this was going to be an historic moment for peace, and that just covered the main news for like weeks. I think they were there for 2 weeks to hammer out a deal. In the end, Arafat walked away and then launched what was known as the Second Palestinian Intifada. The Palestinians like to say that it was Ariel Sharon, a minister in the opposition, who ignited it by going up onto the Temple Mount. But then we also saw lots and lots of terrorist attacks like we're seeing today. So the signs are very similar to the situation that Israel faced in 2000, which of course was over 20 years ago.
Yes, and I think as said earlier, that the people on the in the Palestinian-controlled areas, they don't see movement, they don't see change, and there is this ghastly stalemate which has gone on for well, I mean, I remember the 1993 Oslo Accords, which was supposed to usher in peace and prosperity, and the Americans paid a lot of money to train the Palestinians, gave them a police force. And I was actually in Jerusalem in 1996 when there was a rumour spread that the Israelis were going to attack the Temple Mount or something. I know they sort of tunnelled underneath.
Yeah, they dug a
yes,
tunnel
exactly.
underneath. Yeah.
And then you had the Palestinian trained police, or trained by the Americans, firing on the Israelis.
I was there at the time as well, yeah. So it was a big escalation in violence and what have you. So, but I think a lot of this unrest has come from the corruption within the Palestinian Authority, the fact that they are corrupt. They are also imported as well from the area. So when, as you mentioned, the Oslo Accords that were signed on the lawn of the White House lawn back in 1993 with Yasser Arafat, those Palestinians that were high up in the PLO had never actually visited the territories known as Judea and Samaria, or where the Arab Palestinian populations actually live. So they weren't indigenous to that land. They came from neighbouring Arab states or even in Europe. So when Arafat then established what was known as the Palestinian Authority and became its chairman, he brought all his cronies in. He gave them top jobs, ministerial portfolios, huge mansions bought with European, British, American taxpayers. And then since then, it's just nothing but been a massive great gravy train for the BLOs. So the young Palestinians who feel like there isn't much hope for them, there's not much chance for them of having a better future because of the corruption within the Palestinian Authority, that they then like to blame this all on Israel. And of course, then they're promising them jihad and violence against Israel, and that's not coming. And this combined, as you mentioned earlier in the program, the incitement to hatred, the incitement to violence on the Palestinian education system, its media, and now a new phenomenon, which is this huge influence within social media. And before, we had influence with Facebooks encouraging knifings and stabbings, and now it's moved on to TikTok. So the situation has become very, very toxic and also very, very dangerous.
Yes, exactly. And another actually, I just want to air a concern here. As a former teacher, my teaching union, the NEU, which is now on strike, there is a lot of pro-Palestinian brainwashing going on. They take the teachers on so-called fact-finding trips to Cuba or to Ramallah. They don't take them to the rest of Israel. As far as I know, they don't go to Yad Vashem and see the Holocaust Memorial Museum, anything like that. But they go to Ramallah and hear a lot of one-sided stories about what goes on, and then they come back and tell their students this. So another concern of mine is that when the next events erupt, that there'll be even less sympathy here, because in the classrooms, the children will be told, oh, well, it's because of the Israelis' fault, because of the conditions that Palestinians live under. It's always the Israelis' fault. If they don't have water, they don't have electricity.
Yeah, no, and that is the great danger, really. It's kind of spreading the lies, the propaganda and everything else. And this is why this programme tries to address a lot of that misbalanced information and present the facts of what's going on. So according to the Times of Israel, back on the 26th of February, a Palestinian terrorist shot dead in cold blood two Israeli brothers, Hallel Yaniv, 21, and Yigal Yaniv, 19, as they were driving through the Arab town of Huwara in the north of Samaria. They were residents of the nearby Huwara settlement, and they were shot whilst being on a traffic jam on Route 66 highway. According to the article, that graphic footage from the attack of Huwara shows the victim's car riddled with bullets. Troops at the scene found 12 9mm shells castings, indicating the attacker used a handgun or a makeshift submachine gun. Initial probe of the shooting suggested that the gunman tried to take out as well the Israeli ambulance service, Magen David Adom, and said that the medics who were treating the two men were critically hurt and they were then taken to hospital. However, they were later announced dead. So sadly, the MDA did a great job in trying to save their lives, but sadly they couldn't. And the IDF said it had launched a manhunt for the terrorists, closing off several roads in the area. And of course, then we saw the outpouring of violence by Jewish extremists on the Arab town of Huwara. Let's go now to the kind of latest CBN news reports looking into this escalation of Palestinian terrorism and violence being directed at Israel.
Palestinian terrorists shot and killed American citizen Ilan Ganeles on a main Israeli highway near the Palestinian Arab town of Jericho. The terrorists then shot at another car, set theirs on fire, and fled in another vehicle. After Monday's murders of two Israeli brothers, there's talk this recent violence could lead to a third intifada or uprising.
The general big picture is one of, I'd say, at least 3 months of continuous terror attacks by different Palestinian organizations and responses and countermeasures by Israeli security forces.
Former IDF spokesman Jonathan Conricus says this could lead to what he called a rolling escalation.
We're coming into the month of Ramadan, which historically speaking, even though it's a holy month for Muslims, historically speaking, it's a month of terror for Israelis.
Monday's attack sparked unprecedented Israeli retaliation that resulted in widespread condemnation.
I understand the hard feelings, but this isn't the way. We can't take the law into our own hands. Israel's government, the State of Israel, IDF, the security forces, they're the ones who need to crush our enemies.
U.S. State Department spokesman Ned Price expressed U.S. concern about the weekend violence and Israeli rioting.
It is imperative that Israel and the Palestinians work together to de-escalate tensions and to restore calm.
Shai Golan, who heads a settlement council in biblical Judea and Samaria, also known as the West Bank, condemned the rioting and said it's not the way of settlement leaders.
To take the law into one's hands and burn things, this is not the way of Judaism, not the way of the Jews. There is a state, and only the state will manage these events.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem. When hundreds of Israelis descended on the town to take revenge, clashing with Palestinians and setting houses, cars, and a junkyard on fire. One Palestinian was reportedly killed. Israeli security forces used tear gas and stun grenades to restore order. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said security forces were pursuing the killer of the brothers and called for calm.
I ask that even when the blood is boiling and the spirit is hot, not to take the law into your hands. I would like to let the IDF and the security forces do their job. I remind you, in the last few weeks, they have eliminated dozens of terrorists and prevented dozens of terrorist attacks.
The attack took place as Israeli and Palestinian Authority officials were holding a security summit in Aqaba, Jordan. Jordan called the meeting, which included U.S. and Egyptian officials, in a bid to calm rising tensions ahead of the Muslim fasting month of Ramadan 3 weeks from now, when terrorism often ramps up. According to a statement from the Jordanian Foreign Ministry, the two sides agreed to de-escalate the situation. With no end in sight, the Yaniv brothers' mother, Esti, delivered a message to the young people of her community. God sends us grace. Even with this painful blow, he sends us grace. We have a huge hole in our heart. Nothing will ever fill this hole. Not construction, not protests, nothing. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And we're now joined on Behind the Headlines with Stefan Silva, who is not only a messianic leader in Israel, but he's also an IDF reservist and also the son of David Silva, that's very familiar to our viewers. Firstly, Stefan, welcome to Behind the Headlines. Nahag Sameach, because today, as of this recording, is Purim. But can you give us your thoughts on what we're seeing on this massive upsurge in terrorism and violence being directed against Israel on behalf of the Palestinians?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. It's wonderful to be here with you on the show again. And happy Purim to you and to all the viewers as well. And yeah, it's kind of that time of the year, as they say, coming up to Ramadan and just everything that's been happening politically within Israel. It's like the perfect storm is brewing. and bringing Israel and the Palestinian people to a point of heightened violence and tensions. We've had a very, very bloody start to 2023. January and February, we've had a lot of terror attacks taking place all throughout Judea and Samaria, within Jerusalem as well. Obviously the most terrible thing about that is the severe loss of life, innocent civilians and also security personnel, soldiers who are just being brutally murdered and targeted just simply for being Israelis. And really the situation here, it's like a pressure cooker. And there's this constant pressure that's being built in the out in the towns and in the fields and on the highways and the byways, and if that pressure isn't released, and there have been up until now various mechanisms for releasing that pressure, just like in a pressure cooker that our viewers would be using at home to cook all kinds of things, and if that pressure is not released from time to time, then eventually it will explode. And that is what we're witnessing right now, that the pressure is mounting. It's not being released because of breakdowns in relations between the Israeli government, the Palestinians, Hamas and their influence and the way that they're influencing the situation, and just this buildup that is constantly happening day in and day out. And it's just leading to this point of eruption. And I think, the worst could very much still be ahead of us. And that's kind of internally here within our, small region of Israel, Judea and Samaria, Gaza, and with not even taking into account Iran and everything that's cooking, a few thousand or a few hundred miles east of us.
Yeah, and Stefan, what are your thoughts on the horrendous terrorist attack that we saw over a week ago, in which two young Israeli brothers were shot down as they were driving through an Arab town known as Huwara in the north of Samaria, and then, of course, the violence that followed by Jewish extremists setting rows to cars, burning shops and houses in response to the murder of these two young Israeli brothers in Judea and Samaria?
Yeah, I mean, it's terrible. Again, it's just the circle of unending violence that has been going on for generations. It has times of that it's heightened and it's felt more, which is what we're feeling right now. There are times where it's kind of on the slow cooker, on the low burner, as they say. These two young men who were gunned down, completely heart-wrenching. I mean, these guys are, the salt of the earth. As we say here in Israel, it's a term that we used for people who are patriotic, who give to their country. These guys were, one of them served in the military, the other one was about to serve in the military, and they were targeted and shot while driving through a Palestinian town on Route 60, which is known as the Route of the Fathers, Tzir Avot. It's the same route, more or less, where the patriarchs would have moved throughout Judea and Samaria, along with all of the, people who lived throughout the generations. The main highway through Judea and Samaria, through the very hilly region that is there for those of our viewers who are familiar with the area. And like I said, it's heart-wrenching, seeing the funeral, seeing the parents, the father, the mother, the young siblings. They were the two older brothers in the family. I think they had another 3 or 4 younger siblings. And just seeing them and their community being hit like this, with this double murder of these 2 young men is just absolutely terrible. But like I said, this was not, it didn't just happen out of the blue. This specific attack, it's the last in a long series of attacks that have happened throughout January and February, and it's been building and escalating as the time has gone on. And, when these things happen, then 2 wrongs don't make a right. And unfortunately, what we saw after that, like you mentioned, Simon, was the Jewish violence that was then aimed and kind of channeled towards Huwara. And there was Jewish violence against Palestinians who weren't necessarily involved in anything that had happened. And that obviously was fueled very much as well by some of the ministers in the new right-wing extreme government that we have now in Israel, and that definitely didn't help the situation. And that's just adding fuel to the fire. There's a few dangerous men, in my opinion, who are holding the helm and holding the keys to some key positions in our government, and they are not helping the situation calm down. They're just adding the fuel to the fire. And like in all of these situations that have happened, I fully identify with the desire for retribution and to get back and to bring the people who did this to justice. But the way to do that is not by going and harming innocent people or people who had no involvement in the specific matter, but rather leaving it to the IDF, to the government, to the security agencies, who are very, very good and well trained and honed in bringing the terrorists to justice, whether dead or alive. And that's what should be done in these situations.
Thank you, Stefan. So you've agreed that the settlers were emboldened by the current very patriotic government, and we're witnessing huge Israeli-Arab tensions in Judea and Samaria. Do you think this is definitely going to ignite into a third intifada or Palestinian uprising?
Well, yeah, definite is a tough word to use. I don't think anything is definite in the Middle East here or anywhere for that matter. But I think there is a very high probability of that. That's the fear of Israel's leading defense personnel right now, is that the situation is gonna turn into be an uncontrollable situation, really, where everything will break loose, where violence will erupt, both within Judea and Samaria and within Israel. And they're very worried about a complete or a severe loss of control and an uprising even from within Israel, among Israel's Arabs, like we saw back in 2021, especially in the mixed cities, one of them being Haifa, which we live right next to. And just seeing that, the violence from within Israel, and then it being on two fronts in that sense, in Judea and Samaria, but then also within Israel. And the military is not allowed to operate in Israel in the same way that it's allowed to operate in Judea and Samaria due to the legalities of it. Hamas is sending its tentacles into Judea and Samaria. It's influencing the Palestinians in those areas through social media, spreading lies about the Temple Mount, glorifying some of these other attackers who have carried out their attacks. We've got Ramadan just a couple of weeks away, and that's always a heightened time of tension, especially in Jerusalem, and especially the Temple Mount. That is like the powder keg, and if any of the sparks, fly over towards that powder keg, it can cause an eruption, and that's also the catalyst. I think I hope everybody is aware of that the Temple Mount is being used as the catalyst in order to drum up this tension and cause this pressure to be raised within the Palestinian population. And they'll definitely try to use that to try and create more pressure on Israel, to try and throw more fuel on the fire, and for violence to erupt within Judea and Samaria. And like we said before, so that's coming from the Palestinian side, but then the current government's policies in Judea and Samaria, the statements that some of our ministers have been making are definitely not help calm the situation either. And so it looks like it's heading towards that direction of a severe eruption of violence, which could, like I said, spill over into Israel as well.
So, Stefan, how should our prayers be praying regarding this very tense security situation that Israel faces, not only with the prospect of a possible third intifada initiated by Hamas, with rockets and missiles being fired from Gaza, trouble on the Temple Mount, violence in Judea and Samaria against the Jewish communities, plus also possibly the Israeli Arabs living in Israel targeting their fellow Jewish citizens. And also we're seeing the massive protests against this government over its legal reform, and even pilots in the Israeli Air Force refusing to go on combat missions. So we know that the situation is tense. We know that the Iranians are so close now to developing nuclear weapons as well. As Christians, how can we pray into this deteriorating security situation that Israel finds itself in today?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, it's important that we really do pray according to God's will. We all have our opinions, whatever they may be. There may be people groups that we like more and like less. There may be politicians that we like more and that we like less. But ultimately, we need to be praying that the Lord's will be done. And I know that's very general, but that's kind of maybe a general guideline that the Lord's will be done. And, I think these events, as terrible as they are, they're unfolding, and they were foretold, not specifically, but generally speaking. And I think overall, they're only going to get more intense, and they're going to get worse as time goes on, because that is what the Bible says is going to happen. Israel is going to be marginalized more. There are going to be attacks from all over. There is going to be a lot of violence that we read about in Scripture taking place in and around Israel in the end times that I believe that we're in. And so within that, we need to be really seeking God's will and praying that His will be done. I believe can continue to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, continue to pray against the spirit of violence, against the spirit of hatred and division, both internally in Israel, among the Jewish people, but also the division between the Jewish people and the Arabs, or the Palestinians more specifically. Pray for the local body of believers here in Israel. I think that should be maybe even one of the top on the list, because this new extremist government that we have, a lot of the laws that they're wanting to pass are going to be aimed towards us as a messianic community, trying to prevent us from being who God has called us to be. And we see that persecution could be very, very close for us. If it was something that we couldn't really see happening a year ago, then now it's very, very clear and could be very, very imminent. I think we need to continue praying for the leaders here in Israel and of the other nations around, just like we're commanded to, and praying also for the Palestinian people. I mean, that God would reveal Himself to them as well, and that they also would cry out to God, and also from within Israel, especially with the social unrest that we have right now, because of the judicial reform, just that the nation again would look unto the one who will really bring the right reform, and the one who will truly and wholly unite and bring peace and comfort. And that, of course, is Yeshua the Messiah, not any politician, not any person of any kind. So yeah, maybe those are some general points to be praying into, and for protection, obviously, for the people of Israel and those who are innocent, both in Gaza and in Judea and Samaria as well.
Stefan, just want to thank you so much for joining us on Behind the Headlines today, and pray that you and your family stay safe at this time. And thank you also for that call of prayer that we should pray for the peace of Jerusalem, particularly as we start to see the security situation deteriorate in Israel. So thank you for joining us today. And it's great to get Stefan Silva's thoughts really on this growing escalation of violence and terrorism in Israel, but also what's really, really important as well is points for prayer and intercession, and to continue to remember Israel on our prayers, and to pray for the peace of Jerusalem as well as the Messianic Jewish community in Israel. And according to my notes here as well, in response to the rioting we saw at Huwara, the Arab town that is in the upper regions of the Judean hills. The Defence Minister Yoav Gallant also said he approved of bolstering of military forces in the West Bank with the aim of expanding defence operations in settlements and the roads. It's known that Huwara has also been a flashpoint in Judea and Samaria, and it's just about the only Palestinian town through which Israelis regularly travel in order to reach settlements in the northern Judea of Samaria. They've also witnessed several shooting attacks on Israeli motorists on Route 60 in Huwara. And over 60 Palestinians have been killed since the beginning of the year, most of them while carrying out attacks or during clashes with security forces. And of course, there was a major Israeli counter-terrorism operation in Jenin, because Jenin is is now completely out of the control of the Palestinian Authority and their security, that Palestinian Authority personnel cannot even enter the town. And this is why this is becoming the latest center for Palestinian terrorism being directed against Israel.
Yes, it's interesting what David Silver said about, Stefan Silver said about Route 60 being known as the road of the fathers, and which the patriarchs would have travelled on through Judea and Samaria, and now it's just being used to pick off Israeli motorists.
Yeah, which is a horrendous way to die. A very, very callous act of terrorism as well. But also we've got to explain the whole situation as well that Stefan mentioned on with this new Israeli government and how the situation is that fuel has been added to the fire by Israel's Finance Minister Smotrich, who's reportedly said that Israel should wipe out the Palestinian town of Huwara. Yes. He also then liked a social media post calling for the eradication of the Arab town. And has since withdrawn his statements as well. So really seeing that from extreme ministers within Israel's government are fueling the flames of tension between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We're also seeing as well that there's a lot of youth unrest within the Palestinian Authority. And of course, this is just creating a cocktail of violence, and Israel is very much like that. That it's you can be out there. It's a beautiful country with beautiful people. You're in God's land. You're in the land of the Bible. But you also see situations now and again where everything heats up and the violence escalates. And then that's not a good time to actually be in it.
I just want to make the point about what Smotrich said, the Minister of Finance, about wiping out Huwara. I mean, that's one comment on social media. Or you've quoted two actually, but even so, I wouldn't call that a campaign of incitement. So the Israelis don't live under that. They've got a free press, and they have a well-trained IDF, like Stefan Silver was saying. So they have their own, a civil and civilized society. So they are not. There was one rampage by these people. It was awful, but it's not a consistent thing, and the whole society is not behind them in this, nor is their government behind them.
But when you have a minister like Smotrich actually coming out and saying we need to kind of wipe out this town, or liking social media posts, knowing that he is the Minister of Finance in the Israeli government, as a minister, you've got to be very, very careful about what you say and how this can then lead to an escalation in violence. And of course, what we're seeing now is some of the more extreme elements within Israeli society have been encouraged and supported by the likes of Itamar Ben-Gvir, the very controversial new security minister, together with the Finance Minister Smotrich, who are at the most extreme end of Israeli politics.
To give Ben-Gvir credit, on that clip we saw him saying, we need to rely on our own forces. So that was good. It's interesting, though, I suppose, in this country, if a minister had said, right, we should, wipe out, say, a Northern Irish Catholic town, if there'd been during the Troubles, then yes, he'd have had to resign. But I assume that Smotrich is still in post.
No, exactly. He has withdrawn his statement and stuff as well. But it just shows you the toxic situation and the different ideological divisions there are within the current Israeli government led by Benjamin Netanyahu. And it's certainly a shift from the centre, and almost then a shift to almost some of the extreme elements within Israeli society and within Israeli politics as well. So this is something that we have to be very, very concerned about. But also the fact here as well, for example, it says that, according to this, that on Monday evening, Israel's President Isaac Herzog condemned the settlers' action as cruel and violent rampage, and was also attacked by Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, said he held the Israeli government fully responsible for the terrorist acts of the settlers. Now, I've been up to Judea, Samaria. I've met many of the settler community, and the vast majority of them are decent, loving people that believe that this is the biblical land of Israel. This is where they chose to live. This is where they want to be, because they know this is where their ancestors come from, and they are then directly have a closer connection to the Bible because they're living there. But the difference is that whatever the escalation in terrorist attacks facing the Israelis, you don't go into a town and torch their cars or shops or homes where kind of innocent Arab residents living there who are not even involved in the conflict. You need to allow the IDF and Israel's security services like Shin Bet to find the culprits and bring them to justice. And that's the danger now, that we're seeing this breakdown of law and order because of the more extreme elements within this new Israeli government. I think that this is a green light for them to do what they want to do. And of course, that leads to a breakup of law and order.
Well, yes, but also we saw that in the clip that the IDF immediately swung into action and were controlling their own people, which the Palestinians forces would never do. They would never rein back their own people, and that's your democracy.
Absolutely, but Israel is obviously judged on a different moral standard,
of course, than
our neighbours or even most European or Western nations.
Well, absolutely, because I was listening on the typical BBC reporting recently. They always make the Israelis' reactions sound as if they were the initiation. So they sort of said that it's talking about one of these targeted operations by probably Shin Bet's unmatched intelligence services in the I think somewhere in the West Bank, and they said what they went in and did and how many Palestinians died. They don't say how many the IDF were killed or injured, and then they say after that, oh, this was in response to this terror or this murder or something, an attack, and it's the old story of the Israeli takes lion's breakfast.
No, very true. And this is the difficulty that Israel has to face, because anything that she does is under a massive microscope of world opinion, and particularly when it relates to Israeli kind of violence, as we saw in the Arab town of Huwara. This then gets picked up by all the major TV news networks. The politicians then condemn Israel. Israel faces commendation from the UN. And really seeing the situation, as we saw from the leaders of the Council of Samaria, trying to de-escalate the conflict, allow the army, allow Israel's security forces to take care of the situations, but don't take justice into your own hands. And of course, then this is being shown around the world. We're doing a program on it today, but really not focusing on that, but really focusing on the fact that Hamas have a prepared strategy to potentially launching a third intifada or Palestinian uprising against Israel. So, according to an article that's published by the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs entitled Anti-Terror Campaign in Nablus portends a major new Palestinian conflict. It says the main focus of the article is that Israel could be only a matter of weeks away from a Palestinian uprising known as an intifada. So Israel carried out a successful IDF counter-terrorism operation in Nablus on Friday, the 22nd of February, in which 8 out of the 12 Palestinian terrorists belonging to a new terrorist organization called Lion's Den. The others were from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP. This, according to the the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, was the third such operation in 2023 in which Israeli special forces have carried out operations deep into Palestinian cities to prevent terrorist attacks on Israel. The past 2 counter-terrorism operations were in Nakbat, Jabba, a refugee camp near Jericho, and also Jenin refugee camp. And according to the JCPA article, after Israel's last military operation in Gaza in 2021, new terrorist cells have been established in the north of Samaria without the Palestinian Authority interference, and they also refused to fight them despite them losing control and the security of the area. So really what we're seeing as well is, which is leading to this increase of violence and terrorism is the destabilizing of the Palestinian Authority run by Mahmoud Abbas, known as the PLO or the Fatah faction. And young Palestinians are becoming disillusioned because they don't want a military confrontation with Israel. They want to fight Israel internationally. They want to use the United Nations to attack Israel diplomatically. They want to send Israeli generals and IDF soldiers into the court in The Hague to so-called face war crimes. And they want to put pressure on the Biden administration to put pressure on Israel. So they are showing different ways of wanting to fight. But the young Palestinians on the ground are joining and attracted to these Palestinian terrorist organizations, particularly this new one called Lion's Den, want a violent confrontation. They want the glorification that goes with being a Palestinian terrorist, as these are kind of glorified within Palestinian society.
Absolutely, and as we know, the Palestinian Authority has always paid the salaries of terrorists while they're in jail, in Israeli jails.
No, absolutely. So what's also very disturbing regarding this article is that this article in the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs suggests that we're heading for a massive wave of Palestinian terrorism to mark Ramadan, which occurs between March the 22nd and April the 20th, 2023. So it says here that Palestinian terrorist organizations are planning to increase their terrorist attacks against Israel during the month of Ramadan. Hamas leader Ismail Hanini published a statement on the 23rd of February. He said the following: the Palestinian people will not allow anyone to suppress the intifada that was developing in the West Bank. The campaign against the enemy is entering a stage of strong desperation and breaking the occupiers and expelling them from the land of our fathers and grandfathers. They say, why now? Because Hamas believe they have a strategic edge to launch a third intifada. The Palestinian Authority is declining in its power and influence. The new Israeli government is in a state of diplomatic confrontation with the international community, and the Jewish state is facing massive social and political crisis within its own society, particularly over this new government, and of course the legal reforms he wants to bring out are causing massive demonstrations daily against the new government. We're seeing that a new generation of Palestinians want an uprising and confrontation with Israel, and have never experienced the last one that occurred in between 2000 and 2005. They are disillusioned with the corruption within the Palestinian Authority. Palestinian incitement and terrorism and the glorification of terrorism through its education system, its media, has influenced an entire generation, and social media has also played a major role in radicalizing young Palestinians, such as TikTok, the Chinese-owned social media giant, is being used to create what is known as Palestinian TikTok heroes. And according to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, within Palestinian society itself, there's no real desire for a major confrontation with Israel, because over 160,000 Palestinians depend on Israel for their work to feed themselves and their families.
Exactly. And like we were saying earlier, you know, the majority of the settlers want to have decent, quiet family lives. So do the majority of Palestinians. They're essentially decent people, and they just want to live in peace and let their children grow up and have as best a life as they can. But there is this stalemate within their society. They don't have the opportunities to better themselves, to grow, because of the constant incitement, the constant focus on Israel as the enemy, or the awareness that they don't have a democracy. And Mahmoud Abbas is voted in, apparently, election after election. He's made him virtually president for life now, isn't he?
No, of course, and of course he's only served one term, but is still in power, and he's not getting any younger either. So if he leaves or dies in office, then there's going to be a succession problem within Palestinian political apparatus, and we know that, for example, if the Palestinian Authority open up to elections within the Palestinian Authority, then Hamas will win. There's no doubt about that.
But just, I thought, I mean, we know that the Gaza and the Palestinian Authority have different governments, essentially, because Hamas did a takeover in Gaza. Do you actually think that that is from God, from the Lord, to actually their rivalry, their lack of communication, or their opposition. It's actually, in a way, it blesses Israel because it doesn't have two-pronged attacks.
I think that's a difficult question to answer because they by nature are two very different governments. I mean, first of all, you have Hamas, that is an internationally recognised genocidal terrorist organisation based in Gaza, where they overthrew the PLO representatives in 2007 in a coup d'etat. So they are controlling the entire Gaza Strip. Their whole desire is to wipe Israel off the face of the earth and create an Islamic state. Whilst I think within the Palestinian Authority itself, they're kind of more moderate. Yes, they have the same goals. They want to see the destruction of the state of Israel.
Just less open about it.
Yes, and of course they want the cooperation that comes from the international community. They want the money that comes in from the major donors such as Britain, the EU, and also the United States as well. And essentially they do not want to see in place a kind of Islamized government of the nature of Hamas in power. But they will work with them to gain advantage. But at the same time, these two entities are pretty much hate each other and against itself, and they're only kind of united in their desire to want to see Israel destroyed. The only difference is the tactics and how they go about doing that and achieving that. But according to the same article as well, the reason why there hasn't been a Palestinian uprising as yet is because of internal Palestinian divisions between Fatah, the PLO, and Hamas, we just mentioned. Also, the Palestinian Authority refuses to sponsor terrorist activities of the armed Palestinian terrorist organizations against Israel. Now, we're just going to read out very, very quickly the Hamas Ramadan terrorism plan. So Palestinian incitement machine will be in full steam for Passover, which occurs on the 5th to the 13th of April this year, which will overlap Ramadan. Jewish groups are planning activities on the Temple Mount and the Western Wall during Passover. Palestinian television will broadcast their usual lies and propaganda against Israel, and in which the Israelis tend to take over the Temple Mount and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, as we know from the interview with Stefan. That's a major flashpoint. There's also been an increase in Jewish visitors to the Temple Mount, as 3,670 visited last year and more expected this year. Even some religious zealous Jews may even proclaim their intention to restore the millennial-old Passover lamb sacrifice this year. An Israeli attempt to change the status quo in the Temple Mount is, from an Islamic viewpoint, would be the equal to crossing a red line. And according to the JCPA, Hamas have been planning for a long time to ignite a new intifada in East Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, to use the Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, possibly through a hunger strike, to ignite violence on the Temple Mount, and this is how they could bring it about in practice. The Hamas could organise civil disobedience in Arab neighbourhoods in East Jerusalem, start off a war attrition between armed Palestinian terrorist organisation in Nablus and Jenin against the IDF and Israeli civilians living in Israel, fire rockets and missiles from Gaza into Israel to support the new intifada, and calls for Israeli Arabs to launch attacks against Israeli soldiers and civilians. And in summing up, we really need to be praying for Israel during this in this very dangerous season that she's entering into, of the possibility that a third Palestinian intifada uprising could be launched against her.
This plan about Passover really is quite precise, isn't it? I'm not sure where they got the intelligence from, but it does look like a perfect recipe. I mean, Stefan Silver said this is a perfect storm, we're heading towards this, and if you've got this sort of blueprint here, but at least we know in advance and can pray, particularly during Passover, maybe the 5th to the 13th. Not just have our Passover suppers in churches or whatever, but to actually be really mounting some, quite active prayer for this time.
No, absolutely. And of course, once all this kicks off, it's horrible to see. Having been in Israel during the second intifada with the suicide bombings taking place, no one walking around the streets of Jerusalem, we don't want to see an escalation of violence being directed against Israel. And of course, there's huge amounts of social unrest in Israel as well, with massive protests and demonstrations against the new government's plan to reform Israel's legal system, IDF pilots refusing to fly in combat out operations in support of this government. So internally, there are massive divisions within Israel.
Financially, it's always tough, isn't it? Because some of the organisations, one of them which helps Jews make aliyah from the nations, so that they are returning because of the high cost of living. It's very expensive there.
Well, Israel's very expensive, but Israel has the 4th best economy in the world right now. So that's the paradox of living in Israel, that Israel's economy is doing well, Israel's startup nation is doing well, but to actually live in Israel is very, very expensive. But we know that this is where God wants his Jewish people to be, living and residing in the land of Israel. He will protect them, but we can play our part by praying and interceding for Israel, but also calling out lies when we see them, calling out propaganda, and particularly because this program is ahead of time, that Ramadan won't start for another 2 weeks. This is the latest kind of military assessment produced by the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, in which they believe that Hamas is planning to orchestrate a third Palestinian uprising, and this is how they plan to do it. But it also then depends on the will of the Palestinian people themselves, because if there is no will to engage in massive violence against Israel, then it won't happen. But clearly, Hamas are trying to play a major role in trying to overthrow Fatah and become the most dominant force within Palestinian society and direct campaigns against Israel, to direct the international community. But we know that Hamas is a prescribed genocidal terrorist organization that doesn't have much support outside of Qatar and outside of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so therefore they lack that international legitimacy that Fatah and the PLO currently have with its relationships with the Biden administration, its strong relations with the European Union as well, to try and bring about a Palestinian state as a means to destroy the modern state of Israel. So we know that a lot's at stake.
Do you think that things start getting ignited, that Hezbollah in the north, who are running Lebanon, that they, and funded hugely by and armed by Iran, that they will join in and just be looking for an opportunity?
No, because strategically the Iranians are waiting to see what the Israelis do in terms of their development nuclear weapons. We know that this is also coming close, that they are up to 86% capacity of enriching uranium, and they only need another 4%, and they're at 90 grade uranium enrichment, which means that they will then have weapons grade nuclear weapons, which to Israel is beyond a red line. So if the Israelis then carry out military airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, that's when Hezbollah will be deployed against Israel, and combined with this threat from Iran, from Hezbollah in the north, and now Hamas wanting to instigate a Palestinian uprising, the situation in Israel looks extremely precarious.
And there's also the story in the Jerusalem Jewish Chronicle last week about how Iran is employing British criminal gangs to list prominent Jews in this country. So if Israel tries to do something against Iran, then they will hit the diaspora.
Yeah, which is a major concern, and that's why the British security forces need to step up and protect prominent Jewish individuals and Jewish buildings, and of course that always happens in any retaliation. And even, for example, if this situation gets out of hand and Israel has to go back into Gaza again, we know that this will lead to escalation of violence and terrorism in this country, in Europe and across the world against the Jewish community, and then we'll see another massive spike in the rise of Jew hatred as well. So the situation, I think, that Israel facing right now, Melanie, is very precarious. Well, thank you so much for being my co-host on Behind the Headlines. You've done a great job. Thank you so much. And I want to thank you for watching at home. There is no doubt in the coming weeks that Israel faces an unprecedented security situation, particularly with the Iranians so close to developing nuclear weapons. The fact, as we mentioned on this program, that Hamas are wanting to prepare to launch a third Palestinian uprising, or what is known as intifada against Israel, using the Temple Mount as the trigger to fire rockets and missiles into Israel to stir up hatred within Judea Judea and Samaria against the Jewish settlers there, but also attacking Israeli Arabs. As Christians, we need to stand in solidarity with Israel by praying and interceding for the peace of Jerusalem at this very critical time. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Behind Headlines.